Thank you for the invitation to come talk to you tonight. And get my slides going. I was really excited whenever he gave me the invitation to come speak, because this is a topic that was something that I started researching in grad school, and somewhat of the way that I've structured the talk is the kind of the evolution of my own thinking and my own research pattern. And so you'll see that the first part of the talk, we're going to talk about the importance of property rights, understanding the link between property rights and development. But then we're also going to get into kind of the bigger question of where do property rights come from? And so that really lends us to a lot of kind of interesting questions, and again, kind of ways that we can think about development differently than maybe the way that we have before. And so this is maybe a picture that you guys have seen before. This is a picture of the world at night. What it does is it gives you a very quick snapshot view of countries that are developed and countries that aren't. So whenever we talk about development, especially in economics, economists kind of get slighted for that we only focus on income, or we only focus on GDP. All you guys care about is growth. That's not what we care about. What we care about is people living in prosperity and their own well-being. And this provides you just with an understanding of what that might look like, what it looks like across the world. And where we get to trying to understand this is to not ask the question of what causes poverty. The question is, what explains prosperity? So why has some countries been able to solve this issue and some haven't? And so that's kind of the big overarching question that economists have been asking kind of since the beginning, starting with Adam Smith. So whenever Adam Smith is writing The Wealth of Nations, it's at the cusp of the Industrial Revolution. The world is changing around him. And his kind of big punchline conclusion is it's about property rights or capitalism. So capitalism is private ownership of the means of production. So people being able to own and have rights over their land, their person, their capital, the means of being able to produce. And that is really what provides like a quick answer to explaining that picture. But that's still something that's very much debated. And so economists have really been having this question over and over amongst ourselves and amongst other people. And to understand, okay, well, what explains prosperity? Why have some countries been able to achieve higher levels of development compared to others? And then what is the role of government within that? So whenever we talk about property rights, it's always good to try to provide at least some common knowledge, some common foundation of what we mean by that. So whenever we're talking about institutions, we're looking at property rights as the legal and the social constraints that affect the security of property rights. So kind of within the institutional literature of understanding norms, social constraints, culture, the informal rules or any formal rules that kind of provide incentives and structure our behavior, we tend to focus on the property rights institutions as kind of being fundamental to the rest of those that might develop out of that. So particularly understanding what property rights involve would be something like the right to exclusive use of your property. So the owner has sole possession, control, use of property, can exclude others from using it. So the exclusionary aspect is pretty important. There's some sort of legal protection against invasion from other individuals. The right to transfer, sell, exchange, or mortgage the property. So that's kind of a big picture idea whenever we say property rights institutions, what we mean. However, especially as we get later on in the talk, we'll see that we don't necessarily have a way. There's no magic bullet to get this. And it looks different depending on the context in which we're operating in. So across countries, but also within the US, this looks quite differently. For example, zoning rules and regulations is an infringement on your property rights because it's telling you things you can and cannot do with your property. And so just because we have kind of this common understanding, it doesn't mean that it's kind of binary. So you can think of it more of a sliding scale. That you have right to exclusive use, maybe you can exclude others, but then there's still maybe other rules, restrictions, regulations that you might have to abide by. It does also then affect your incentives and investments that you may or may not undertake. So another reason, pretty good reason to study property rights, as Mises says, is that the continued existence of society depends upon private property. So that's a pretty strong statement. So Mises, some of you that aren't familiar, was writing during what's called the socialist calculation debate. So he's one of the economists that's really battling to try to make this argument that the importance of property rights is not just about the incentives in terms of investment, which we're going to talk about. It's not just about trying to understand, separation, mine and thine. It has major consequences for society. And in fact, our continued existence depends upon it. So why is that such a big deal? Why did Mises make this claim? He's really pushing this advancement that it's moving beyond just even pure economics. And so the way that we now kind of try to understand the major importance fundamentals of property rights is to separate it into Mises' argument, which is the information side, and then the incentive side. So we have this information piece that provides key important foundation for understanding the importance of property rights. And then it also structures our incentives in a very productive way. So just to kind of give a very quick overview of this is what's called the socialist calculation debate. It goes something like this. Without property rights, we don't get exchanges. Okay, so pretty much day 2 in a principles econ class, we start telling you about the importance of trade. Well, we're assuming that you have property rights. So whenever you walk into a principles of econ class, there's an assumption of property rights happening behind all those graphs, all those diagrams. Everything that we're teaching you, for the most part, assumes property rights. But before you can get a trade, a mutually beneficial exchange from taking place, I have to be able to own it. I have to be able to have a right to whatever it is that I'm trying to offer you as an exchange, and whatever you're offering me in return, you also have to have a right to it. So if that doesn't happen, if we're living in a world of insecure rights, then exchanges aren't going to be taking place. Why that's so important is that's where our prices come from. So again, if you've taken an econ class, and in principles class, the way that we talk about price theory is we do our supply and demand graphs. Behind that, the assumption is that we have private property rights. And so it is true that our prices emerge through supply and demand interactions, but what that's really telling you is that we have exchanges taking place. So we get exchange ratios, that's what we call prices. So we have to have property rights in order to have any exchange to take place between us. Through exchanges, through supply and demand interactions, emerges prices. Prices are a beautiful thing because they help us calculate rationally. Profit and loss. Loss is just as important as profit in economics. The way that we understand it, we get prices, we get a profit and loss system. So that's what we're talking about when we say that you can rationally calculate. You have an understanding of valuation, of what consumers value if you're a firm or a business. Because if you're incurring losses, they don't value what you're producing. So you need to stop. In order to get that type of system in place, you have to have property rights. Property rights, exchanges, prices, profit and loss, we can now rationally calculate. And so that's Mises' claim as to why socialism is also impossible. So you can't have a pure socialist system because you can never rationally calculate. And so we can't have a prosperous socialist system because we can't do any sort of rational economic calculation in order for goods to go to where they're most highly valued, their most productive uses. So that's one aspect of property rights that I think is extremely important because, again, a lot of what happens when you walk into a principles of econ class is we assume all of this has been solved. And so, again, I love teaching principles, but I also want to kind of reiterate that a lot of where you're walking into has all of this happening in the background. Most of what we talk about, most of where the conversation ends up when we do talking about property rights, and this is probably because it's more easy to see, is the incentive structure. So private property aligns incentives to promote efficient market allocation and production. So this is Smith's invisible hand. So the idea that us acting in our own rational self-interest provides a benefit to everybody in society, and that is what creates prosperity. That's what starts to explain the differences in that map at night. That's Smith's invisible hand, again, working in a private property rights system. And so it's aligning incentives for you and I to both pursue our best interest, and that ends up helping everybody. And so it allocates, again, our resources to their highest valued use because we can now rationally calculate that. We can figure it out. But then we also have an incentive to move resources to those most productive uses. This allows us to specialize, the specialization, division of labor. Again, all this is happening because of the incentives that we face with private property rights. The other way of thinking about it is that, again, I tend to think that it's easier to see. So if you move out of your parents' house, which if your parents owned your house into a rental property, you start thinking about your own behavior, you probably behave slightly differently. You might not clean up as much. You might not take care of the property quite as much. Because you're not the residual claimant. So if you damage the property, you're not going to necessarily be the one that suffers those consequences. Also, public restrooms. Think about your restroom, maybe in your apartment or your parents' house, versus here. Right? It gets kind of disgusting. So these are the incentive arguments. So understanding private property versus public property, we change our behavior. So we're the same person, we just are operating in two different contexts, and the incentives will change our behavior. We see this play out in entrepreneurship. So again, if you aren't, again, we call this idea of the residual claimant, you're not going to be very entrepreneurial. So if you figure out the next $1 million, $1 billion idea, you're not going to try to pursue that if you can't be the one that benefits from it. So we get technological innovation, we get entrepreneurship, specialization, division of labor, we get capital accumulation. And so this is, for those of you who've been reading Hernando de Soto's Mystery of Capital, this is one of de Soto's major claims about the importance of property rights. Legal property rights is going to lead to more capital accumulation and investment. And that's what's going to underpin an economy to achieve higher growth rates and long-run economic development. De Soto's idea is property rights, we get capital formation, and we get economic growth. So his narrative, his story is rather simple. So we started at kind of a big picture, and now we're starting to narrow down those mechanisms to get a little bit more specific as to how and why property rights seem to explain these cross-country development differences. So for De Soto, it's a pure incentive argument. So we need private property rights, recognition of those property rights in order to get investment and capital formation and long-run economic growth. And so part of his story is that in order to get capital, in order to have any sort of long-run investment, you have to have access to credit. So how does this play out in the data? So I'm going to just show several scatter plots of measures of, okay.
It's the up button. It's the up. If you're looking for a pointer.
Got it, thank you. All right, so we've got property rights measured here. So as we move up the scale, stronger property rights protection, and access to credit as a percentage of GDP, and this is in log form. So it's a very strong positive correlation. So this is cross-country analysis, just raw correlation in the data to say, all right, stronger property rights protection, it does seem to pan out to have stronger access to credit. So you do see part of De Soto's story about if you have property rights, then you can leverage that, use that as collateral to get access to credit. And part of why you might want access to credit is so that you can invest. And one of those, we can see the way that that plays out also with our property rights measures and our stock market capitalization. So also a very strong positive correlation. We see it with capital formation. It's not quite as strong, which is somewhat interesting. And that is something that we can come back to. But again, more property rights, more capital formation, and then this does play out in overall income. So income differences across country, very strongly, positively correlated with more property rights protection. And so these are the basic scatter plots, but there have been a lot of economists that have done all of the fancy econometrics to try to control for what we call reverse causality and endogeneity, and these associations do seem to hold. So there does seem to be something to this story about property rights setting up incentives for you to have access to credit, for you to invest and have capital formation, and this does also then seem to pan out in explaining those cross-country income differences. De Soto also has this phrase called dead capital, and so his kind of story is that with property rights, you unleash dead capital, which allows property to be used as collateral to secure a loan. That leads to the investment or other benefits or capital formation. Dead capital is something, another way of thinking about that is, so in countries with insecure property rights, it's not that you don't have any sort of investment taking place. Everything's gonna just be done at a much smaller scale. So in places where you have insecure property rights, we're gonna talk about in a second where that may stem from, you still have individuals being rather entrepreneurial. It just might not look at like the way that we think about entrepreneurship in a country where we do have secure property rights. And so some of the best illustrations, I think, come from this next series of pictures. So these are taken from Romania. Whenever I first saw these, I mean, on one hand, it's just funny, right? It's kind of ridiculous. But then if you start thinking about, like, why would this have been a decision that this individual made? And on one hand, it might actually be rather entrepreneurial. So the car apparently doesn't have an engine. He has a horse, but he doesn't have maybe something to sit on. So he's taking two different goods or resources and recombining them in a way for him to achieve whatever goal it is in terms of transportation that he might have. Same thing here. Again, we wouldn't see this necessarily playing out in the US, but in Romania, in a country that has relatively insecure property rights, the host of other issues, you gotta move the hay, so this is what capital it is that they're utilizing. This one also is pretty good. You gotta move the cattle, this is all you got to move it with, so that's what you're gonna utilize. So again, in some sense, the way that we think about property rights and entrepreneurship, this is pretty entrepreneurial. You've got a goal, you've got a problem, you've got to resolve, you're gonna utilize whatever's at hand. But I also think that this does illustrate somewhat of the idea of what De Soto was referring to as dead capital. So that's capital, it's just not being utilized in the most efficient or most optimal way, the way that we think about it. Again, and given this person's constraints, it might be. But so his argument is we need to figure out how to leverage capital in a way to make it and utilize it in terms of its most efficient uses. That's then how you're going to see higher growth rates in countries such as Romania starting to grow a lot faster and have higher levels of long-run economic growth. The last picture of them going through the McDonald's drive-thru. So to kind of recap where we're at, we've got private property rights leads to those incentives for production and exchange. That's what sets up our price system. Our price system allows for rational economic calculation. That's where we get the information argument. So Mises' claim about socialism being impossible is an information argument. It has nothing to do with the incentives, the perverse incentives that socialism sets up. Actually, you cannot rationally calculate where goods should be going, where materials should be going. That sets up, again, profit and loss, and that's what leads to innovation. So that whole kind of very quick summary is the way that we kind of think about it, trying to explain the process of economic development and starting to explain why some countries have been able to prosper and some haven't. And again, this is going back even before Adam Smith, but Adam Smith was one that really put the foundational arguments on understanding the importance of private property rights. In some sense, since then, all we've been doing is trying to demonstrate this, restate Adam Smith in modern language, use some data, use some numbers, use some math, but we're pretty much coming up with the same conclusions. Okay, so property rights are so important. Where do they come from? So first, we've got to establish important, necessary, we need it if you want growth and development. And so this is, again, my own kind of process, the way that I started thinking about economics, the way that I started thinking about development. So I jumped on board with, all right, gotta get some property rights. But we've got a couple issues. Property rights, again, is a very broad term. And the way that we can start to separate that out, to get a little bit more specific, is that most of the time we think about property rights as being something that we have to protect each other. So I've got to make sure that you don't come onto my property and steal my cattle or my cabbage or whatever it is that I have that you might want. And you might also be worried and make sure that I'm not coming onto your property to take something valuable that you have. So that's the way that we think about protection among private citizens. But we also have to be able to protect ourselves from the state. And so whenever we start looking at cross-country differences in property rights, we start seeing evidence that the biggest infringement upon property rights is not private to private theft, it's actually state theft or state expropriation. So we have to be able to simultaneously solve both of these problems. So we've got to check ourselves, but we've also got to be able to protect ourselves from state expropriation. And that's a pretty big black box to figure out how to solve. And so what this leads us to, we can get a little bit more specific, is trying to understand where those constraints come from. So we can have formal constraints and informal constraints. And that can happen on both sides. So the way that the U.S., at least the way our narrative is kind of told, the way that we can protect ourselves from state expropriation or state predation is the Constitution. So part of the argument for the U.S. Constitution is to outline these rules, things the state can and can't do, and that allows us kind of a focal point, and then we've developed other mechanisms to try to help make sure that that's maintained. So part of that is narrative would be formal public constraints, so the government willingly tied its own hands. So this is a lot of the Federalist Papers. Madison's dilemma is a state that's strong enough to kind of write these rules is also one that's strong enough to break its own hands. So we've got to figure out ways to make sure that we can protect ourselves from state predation. And then we can come up with maybe other informal constraints. An argument for people who advocate strongly for the right to bear arms, maybe that's an informal constraint on state predation. If they know that their citizens are armed, that they are less likely to do things that you would not like. And then trying to get more at trying to figure out ways to protect ourselves from each other. We have also informal and private means as well. So cultural norms, attitudes, beliefs, customs, the way that we kind of evolve, the way that we interact with each other, a lot of our norms actually kind of underpin this notion of mine and thine, the way that we treat each other. And so we don't just walk up to each other and I wouldn't take your pen or your drink or your phone. Like I have a recognition informally that is yours, and if I did it, not only would you react, but other people would react. What are you doing? We don't do that. So that's more of what we mean by like informal protections, culturally ingrained ideas about protection of property rights. Those arguments can also be scaled up. So it doesn't have to just be cultural. We see lots of different private associations, so homeowners associations, different types of organizations that exist to partly help protect property rights, to define property rights and maybe even enforce those rights. And then we also have formal protection mechanisms that exist, such as contract enforcement. So contract enforcement would fall under this idea of kind of formal recognition that you and I have entered into a contract, that the state, at the end of the day, has a support system that can enforce that. So what we're starting to also get at is the recognition and definition of property rights, and then the enforcement of those rights. And so you have to have both. So we have to have a system that can define property rights, that can enforce it, but then that also has to protect us, again, from each other, and then also protect citizens from the state. So that's why, in some sense, I guess, once I started getting into this, you realize how big of a puzzle this is. And it's somewhat fascinating and simultaneously somewhat frustrating, because there's no, again, like one answer. So I'm just going to tell you I'm not going to have an answer. Not getting an answer out of this tonight. So some illustration of this, again, this is coming from DeSoto's work, is so it gives you a demonstration of different bureaucratic or procedural steps. For example, to obtain legal authorization to build a house on state-owned land in Lima. It takes 207 administrative steps, which can amount to over 6 years, almost 7 years. And so what this is doing is it's demonstrating kind of ineffective property rights. So the state is basically getting in the way. So this is for you to obtain a legal right to build a house. So So again, this is just something I think that coming from the US or a developed country that we just take for granted. We don't really think about it. So then whenever we turn to looking at countries that are poorer or less developed and we start seeing things like this, it starts to become, I think, a little bit more clear. To formalize informal urban property in the Philippines, 13 to 25 years, also a big range. Gain access and register rights in Egypt, again 6 to 14 years. Obtain a sales contract following a 5-year lease contract in Haiti. Can also take an extremely long period of time. So this is giving you an example where the state is involved, so government is involved. It's just now, it's almost doing the opposite of the way that we were thinking about, especially Adam Smith when he's talking about property rights and the state can exist to enforce property rights. That's not what's happening here. This is more of either an infringement of property rights or just getting in the way. So it's making things more complicated. So again, whenever we start thinking about property rights, well, not all property is created equal. So we've got to solve defining property rights. We've got to figure out how to enforce it. And then the different types of rights are also between me and you and us and the state. But then, okay, we can start thinking about, well, we can have open access. So you have no limit on access. So this could be public land, so a city, street, wildlife. That emerges what we call the tragedy of the commons. So that's what sets up those perverse incentives to overuse, for example. So why do we have overfishing? We have overfishing because of lack of property rights. So if you recall your principles of econ classes, we talk about positive or negative externalities, and we talk about public goods, tragedy of the commons. It all has a root cause, lack of property rights. Always. That's the problem. That's what's missing. So why do we have environmental issues? Lack of property rights. And so once we start kind of reformulating and refocusing and thinking along those terms, we can start to, I think, get a better appreciation for some of the things that we need to kind of shift the conversation around. Okay, so we move from open access to maybe government ownership. And that's what we see again in a lot of developing countries, is that the government owns all of the land. Technically, you and I couldn't have legal right to it, the government owns all of it. So we've moved from pure open access to government ownership, but again, that's gonna be regulated by bureaucrats. What we see they do is they create all those administrative steps and burdens for you to get legal rights to even build a house can take years. And so that doesn't really seem to be solving our problem either. If we move from some sort of communal system, which would be regulated by individuals who would bear at least the cost and benefits, we're getting at least somewhat closer to aligning our incentives. So you have the ability maybe to come up with communal norms and communal access. Maybe you can restrict entry. So if you, for example, don't pay your homeowners association fees, there can be some sort of legal recourse. And so even though that's still common property, there's some exclusion restrictions and some enforcement of those rules. This also, we see a lot of communal property whenever we're dealing with natural resources. And so that can be a better system than just pure open access, especially over different types of land or resources that can't be completely privatized. And so then we can move into completely privatizing property rights. And we tend to think about that a lot with land. And then so we again talked about with DeSoto's claim about taking property rights, getting access to credit, being able to leverage that into capital formation and growth. Okay, so what's DeSoto's answer or solution to being able to establish property rights? And he talks about, well, let's just title the land. So we've seen this throughout history. In England, in the US, there's a major land titling. So why can't Peru do that? Or why can't these developing countries do that? And so that was one of his like major kind of arguments, is that we need to have the state recognize the legal rights by defining who owns what, and then we've got to get some sort of enforcement mechanism in there too. So me and a colleague, when we were still grad students, again, this is kind of a quick intellectual history of my experience up to this point. So we read DeSoto, and it kind of creates a lot of different questions for us. We're like, Like, all right, yes, we're on board with property rights. Peru needs property rights. How does Peru get property rights? So it's like, land title. And we're like, wait a minute. So the problem in Peru is that government sets up a lot of administrative burdens, that the government actually comes in and steals land. And so his solution is to have the government fix this problem that they've created. That doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. In the US, we have a major titling system that has worked quite well. That's worked well for our development. But we can't just import something that's happened in a developed country and smack it on a developing country and expect it to have the same payoff. And so it set up us to actually take a trip to Peru and go talk to people. Thought, okay, well, let's go see. What are the Peruvians doing? What do they want? And so we went to some of the rural communities outside of Cusco, and we just talked to people. We just asked them, do you have a land title? Do you want one? So this was in the summer of 2007. And what was fascinating were their responses. And so some of it was, most of the people that we talked to, their communities had a land title. So they did not have individual land titles. They did end up getting a community title. But whenever we would ask them, okay, so you have this title, have you been able to get access to credit? Like, oh, no, absolutely not. So what would happen is they would go through the process of getting their community land title. Another way to think about it is just legal recognition from the state that they had some sort of legal rights over this piece of land. And they would then try to go into a government-ran bank, use it as collateral, and they were like, no, this isn't good enough. And so there was again argument, land title, access to credit, capital formation, growth, didn't seem to work. And so our interpretation of this is that even the government-run banks didn't recognize, a piece of paper written from the government officials as enough security to actually protect that piece of land. So again, in theory, it can kind of make sense because that's what the system that we've had in the U.S. and other developed countries, but it doesn't necessarily solve the problem in countries today that haven't been able to figure out how to achieve secure property rights. The other thing that was quite fascinating in talking to individuals that live there, on the ground, how do they solve these problems, is it's not that they have all of these major land disputes. They actually have figured out a lot of private means, private mechanisms to recognize each other's property. And so they have, in essence, private property rights. It's just not formally recognized by the government. And so what they do is that across communities, they had elected within each community a president, like a local president. So this is completely outside the government. So they have local government and they have federal level government. So all of this is done outside of that. So if they have issues, say across communities, or if there are land disputes, they rely on these individuals that they themselves have elected within their own communities to resolve the disputes. And so then they, in general, would follow whatever the ruling is. And they would say, at time to time, it could get a little bit heated, or they could come up with other issues. But we did ask, okay, well, so if you got cross-community disputes in terms of land, would you then involve the local government? Like, absolutely not. Absolutely not. This is every problem that we have. We solve everything inside the community. We don't need to ask for government. And then one more specific quote is, I don't trust in the government because I think that in the future there could be some problems, and because the interest is very high, banks ask for more warranties, meaning that was more of the land title was not enough as collateral for a loan. And so it was clear in the way that they were discussing these issues that one of the biggest infringements on their property rights was local government and potentially even federal government. So they did not ever want to involve government officials in any sort of disputes, particularly land disputes. And they had already then set up their own kind of private, informal ways of trying to enforce those rights that they were recognizing kind of on the ground at the local level. So these are just some of the pictures in the areas that we were at. And this was the most entrepreneurial person that we talked to. So some llamas and alpacas, and I think I didn't have the picture of the chickens in there. described to us is that, a lot of times they would try to hide like their chickens or their alpacas or their llamas because they didn't know who was coming around, and the local officials, it looked like that maybe you did have some property or some wealth, and there were, lots of bribes and corruption that would also take place. So, kind of what does all of this mean? We started out, property rights, great, awesome, how do we get them? And then kind of end on a, yeah, this doesn't work so well kind of story. We need property rights. And I argue, and a lot of my work since this time has started looking specifically at how culture can enforce property rights. So different cultural norms, how that manifests into private rules, enforcement of those rules. So I would argue that the emphasis on formalizing property is overly done. So the necessary, it's not as necessary as what people would argue to codify the informal into these formal legal titles and recognition from the state, because when you introduce the state, when you introduce the government, you introduce a whole other set of problems potentially. And so that was, again, some of the things that we saw on the ground in Peru. By having the government even come in and title, it set up lots of perverse incentives in different parts of the country. They had different experiences. When they went into title in the Amazon region of Peru, for example, the government realized just how much wealth was there in terms of natural resources and just took it to outright state expropriation. So again, that was not kind of in DeSoto's model, and those are just things that we have to think about in reality. Introducing the state sets up other incentives that we need to take into consideration if we're talking about trying to formalize property rights, and they're doing that marginal cost, marginal benefit analysis. And in theory, land titling sounds like a great policy, but in reality, it might not work out so well. So in places in the US, we see that where titling has done its job, and actually if you move out west, titling works a lot differently, especially with land and water rights. And so even within the US, our system had to be very robust in the sense that it had to respond to the local conditions. And so a lot of development economists, we talk about property rights, and we then talk about, well, you just need state recognition, state definition and enforcement, and this is gonna turn out to be a beautiful thing. And again, somewhat in theory, that's correct, but in application, that's not the way that things are gonna work out. And so that's just more of the recognition of, whenever we're talking about policy, moving from kind of our intuitive understanding, our theoretical, logical understanding into a policy space, that there's a lot more that you've got to take into consideration. So again, what explains prosperity? Still property rights, just that we still don't have a very good idea of how to get them, especially in places that don't really have them. And so this just blows up the difference between North and South Korea, which I'm sure that most of you are not shocked by that, where you can see that in South Korea is relatively lit up, and North Korea is not, and we see those massive income differences. So this does tell kind of the story where in South Korea, they're relatively economically free. They have property rights. North Korea, no rights. And that has a major translation into the way that we understand people's choices, the way that they can live their life, their overall well-being. So not just their economic well-being, but their overall social well-being. And it does, in some sense, to me, come back to Mises' quote about the continued existence of society kind of depending on property rights. So whenever you go to the extremes, that starts to become much more of a reality. So if you're living at one extreme of socialism versus capitalism, you can see that what you're doing is basically you're stripping away individual choices and rights. And that is a lot that plays into the other things that we do care about. So, private property is the path to prosperity. Defining and protecting it is difficult to establish. And again, a lot of where my emphasis is on is trying to understand the informal and the local conditions that can enforce property rights or do enforce property rights, and recognizing that more and trying to create a better understanding of how cultural norms and attitudes can manifest itself into private rules and that can manifest that into larger enforcement, where we get other organizations that could be outside the government, but that can establish and create this broader notion of property rights institutions that then do leverage into access to capital and capital formation and investment and long-run economic prosperity. Okay, that's it for the formal talk.